March 13th, 1990. In Hesston, Kansas, locals awoke on one normal, run-of-the-mill weekday morning to unseasonably warm and humid weather for mid-March. At the elementary school in town, a teacher chatted with a neighbor just before the morning bell rang. "Somebody is sure in for it tonight," they remarked. They weren't the only ones in town weary of the unusual heat. Miss Judy, a preschool teacher in that very building, felt something ominous in the air as she walked into work that morning. She could tell this was twister weather. On a whim, she decided to do a tornado drill with her students. A few blocks away, a young couple sat in the grass, cloud watching. They'd point out animals, people, shapes in the sky, completely oblivious to the storms that were brewing off to the west. But to better understand what is about to happen, we must jump back to a couple of days before March 13th. A low-pressure system over the Dakotas had begun to usher in southerly surface winds over much of the plains, bringing deep moisture from the Gulf of Mexico into the region. This deep moisture was noted during the afternoon on the 13th, as abnormally high dew points for March were recorded across much of the plains, with dews in the 60s being a common sight, with locally higher numbers reported in some places. The frontal system mid-afternoon on the 13th was centered over Kansas, with a rather deep low-pressure system attached to it, bringing warm temperatures to much of the central U.S. Along and south of the warm front and east of the dry line, which extended from Great Bend, Kansas to Abilene, Texas, moderate CAPE, or the energy available to fuel storms, of 1,000 to 2,000 joules per kilogram was measured. Strong directional shear also existed from the lower levels to upper levels of the atmosphere, which would cause hodographs, which measure the direction and speed of winds in the atmosphere, to grow large and curved, therefore supporting an intense tornado risk. Combined with an extremely strong upper-level trough overspreading the Midwestern plains, a volatile setup for severe storms and tornadoes was setting up. Due to this, the National Severe Storms Laboratory would highlight a moderate risk of severe storms for much of the Great Plains, and would mention the possibility of a significant tornado outbreak. An ordinary day. People go out and get the mail. Kids play in the streets. Trees sway in the breeze. But storms rise off in the distance, with atmospheric conditions primed for the development of strong supercell thunderstorms. One cell in south-central Kansas begins to explode, towering tens of thousands of feet above the flat fields of the Sunflower State. Near the town of Pretty Prairie, south of the city of Hutchinson, residents and storm spotters on the ground would observe a rapidly rotating wall cloud, with a funnel slowly descending closer and closer to the surface. At 4:34 p.m., that funnel would make contact with the ground. The Hesston F5 had just been born. Slowly, the twister would grind its way through the open farmlands of Reno County, passing close to the unincorporated community of Castleton and the nearby Cheney Reservoir, inflicting primarily F1 and F2 damage to the few structures and objects it did manage to impact. As the tornado passed through areas to the south of Hutchinson, it would rapidly intensify and expand in size, soon exceeding half a mile in diameter. Consistent F3 damage would be observed as the twister narrowly missed the communities of Haven and Burton, crossing into Harvey County. A few miles away in Hesston, the tornado sirens blared. Instead of taking shelter, it seemed as if the warning brought more people out of their homes as they stood in the street, looking to the southwest. There, they laid their eyes on a large black wall of darkness, a massive wedge tornado, inching its way closer and closer to their town. After crossing the Little Arkansas River, the twister would begin to grow more compact, smaller but still intense. One man insisted on staying late at Kropf Lumber to put away that evening's delivery to save it from the rain. He stopped and stared up in awe when he saw the wall of darkness before him. Abruptly, he'd drop everything and rush to shelter. The clock was ticking. Meanwhile, at Hesston College, faculty would rush around campus, urgently trying to convince students to take shelter, as many of them remained frozen in place, watching as the stovepipe tornado in the distance seemed to stand still. To them, it appeared as if it wasn't moving. For many, it never even registered to them that the tornado was actually moving straight at them. By the time everyone got to shelter, only a few seconds remained before impact. Dean Alison was at his home about a mile outside of town. He and his family were getting supper ready, the TV on in the living room. They heard the weathermen talking about the tornado warnings, including one for Hesston. Yet, they went about their evening as usual. Until Renee Alison, Dean's wife, looked out the window. The monster tornado in her sight. Dean would rush to the window and take note of the tornado's trajectory. It was heading right into Hesston. Quickly, he'd dig out his video camera and sit still as the tornado barreled into his hometown, helpless as he watched the devastation. And, just like that, the tornado exited town. As soon as it arrived, it had left, leaving behind a path of destruction right through the heart of Hesston. Cars and trucks totaled in the streets, homes and businesses flattened, the heart of a small Kansas city reduced to nothing but trash, dirt, and bare foundations. Over 80 homes in town were demolished, as were dozens of businesses, factories, warehouses, plumbers, lumber yards, the list went on. Some people in Hesston, however, were lucky. Hesston College, as well as most of the south side of town, were spared by a sudden northward shift within the tornado's path, brought upon by the arrival of a microburst. As the people of Hesston emerged from their storm shelters, many of them would look to the north, where the Hesston tornado was still raging on. Yet, something unusual would catch their eyes. Just outside of Hesston's city limits, another funnel would descend from the clouds a short ways away from the ongoing twister. Slowly, it would descend from the heavens, soon making contact with the ground. One individual stationed a few miles outside of town would capture the twins on video. Note the Hesston tornado growing smaller and smaller as it weakens, before finally merging with its rapidly intensifying successor. The birth of the Goessel F5. Quickly, the Goessel Tornado would expand in size, soon becoming a massive wedge as it tore through the farmlands north of Hesston. The twister would narrowly miss the hamlet of Goessel, directly hitting a series of homes outside of the small community. Several of these structures would be swept clean off of their foundations, virtually nothing left behind. Severe cycloidal ground scouring would be observed in this area as well, alongside extensive foliage damage. NWS surveyors would note that the damage in this area was extreme F5 caliber, ranking it amongst the strongest tornadoes ever documented, a claim backed up by Dr. Ted Fujita, who would say that it was among the most intense he'd ever seen. After passing Goessel, the twister would proceed to the northeast, gradually weakening as it hit isolated homesteads dotting the countryside, before clipping the city of Hillsborough. Shortly after sideswiping the northwest corner of town, the tornado would lift along the shores of the Marion Reservoir. The supercell that produced the Hesston and Goessel tornadoes would go on to produce another long-track twister, an F2 that would tear a 55-mile-long path through mostly rural areas in between Lincolnville and Alma, Kansas. Kansas wasn't the only state to see violent tornadoes that day, though. Nebraska was arguably the worst impacted state of the outbreak. There, an extremely long-track F4 tore an over 130-mile-long path through the heart of the state, devastating the communities of Sutton and Lawrence. 4 additional F3s would terrorize nearby rural areas, including one that would narrowly miss the city of Grand Island, Nebraska, tearing down power lines and significantly damaging a series of farmsteads. Several videos of this specific tornado would be captured, including this one, which depicts the tornado during its multi-vortex stage, a series of funnels all violently rotating around a shared center. Another F4 would strike rural areas near Worthington, Iowa, and 2 more F3s would touch down in the Hawkeye State and neighboring Illinois. By nightfall, it became clear that the central U.S. had just experienced one of its worst tornado outbreaks on record, with all eyes on the 2 most hard-hit communities in Hesston and Goessel, Kansas. The tornadoes took 2 souls with them as they ascended back into the sky. Ruth Voth was 67 years old. Born into a large family, she had 8 brothers and 1 sister. She married her sweetheart Harold in 1950. They moved to Goessel 8 years later in 1958 and eventually set up residence in a converted army barracks a short ways outside of town. A registered nurse, Ruth spent most of her life caring for and giving back to others, primarily at the Bethesda nursing home in Goessel, where she gave comfort to the suffering. She and Harold worked hard their whole lives to support their 2 sons, David and John, and their daughter Martha, and were just beginning to enjoy their golden years when the twister struck their home. They had no basement. Ruth suffered fatal injuries and died that same day. Harold survived, but without his wife of 40 years, he passed on 6 months later. The Fisher family resided in a farmhouse in between Burton and Hesston. As the tornado approached, Dixie Fisher quickly gathered her parents and her 3 boys, Lucas, Garrett, and Brandon, and rushed down to the house's basement. There, they huddled together against a wall, covering their heads and praying. They did everything right. They followed all the tornado safety guidelines. They took all the precautions. But that wasn't enough.
What happened? A large cottonwood tree fell and hit the fireplace. The fireplace fell into the floor and then fell into the basement.
It crushed and killed 6-year-old Lucas Fisher. His brother Garrett suffered leg injuries. A very somber day at Burton School, where Lucas was a first grader.
Kind of sadness. And there's people with the tornado, and then with Lucas, it's just kind of everybody's stunned.
Lucas's best friend, 7-year-old Timothy Jones, came to school this morning and immediately started writing on the school computer.
The tornado picked a tree up and took it up and dropped it on the chimney. And the chimney collapsed and the bricks fell on Lucas's head and killed him. Now I am sad he played with me at least.
I think it's a tremendous test on man's faith, and certainly Kent is a very strong spiritual man, and I think he's going to be able to handle it pretty well. The family seems to be handling it quite well, and so we're thankful for this.
Lucas. He was a little boy with a great big heart, but his life was over before it got a start. He went home to God with an eternal soul. Life without Lucas seems so dull.
As soon as the tornadoes left, the citizens of Hesston and Goessel emerged from their shelters. Around them, piles of debris, pieces of their lives strewn about and scattered. But something that all residents of Hesston noted as they began to walk through the rubble around them was the same common sight: neighbors helping neighbors. Residents from the parts of town spared by the tornado's winds rushed into the affected areas, lifting debris, looking for survivors, helping the injured. Due to a combination of plenty of early warning, a relative rarity for the early 90s, and the immediate aid from first responders and civilians alike, no fatalities were documented within Hesston city limits, despite the twister barreling straight through town. Many people were in shock in the days following the storm. It wasn't uncommon to see individuals strolling through the city, lost amidst the rubble without most major landmarks. But many people also stood up and took action. Among them were students at Hesston College. The student body were called to the school chapel and were given assignments throughout town, people to help, areas where extra hands were needed for debris cleanup. They'd help elderly members of the community sort through possessions recovered in the piles. They'd check on vulnerable neighbors and provide emotional support to those who had lost everything. The students were soon joined by members of the Red Cross, students from other rural colleges throughout Kansas, and an onslaught of volunteers from the Mennonite Church, of which many people within Hesston and neighboring areas were a part of. Truckloads of clothes were being shipped into town from across the state to provide for those whose belongings were lost in the twister. They needed large amounts of volunteers just to sort through the donations. In just a few days, rebuilding efforts were already well underway. Within months, homes were going back up. Businesses were being rebuilt. Some were even reopening. Scars remained in the form of the lack of trees throughout much of the city, and through the memories and the emotions of the area's residents. Those never did quite fade, nor will they ever. Today, a drive through Hesston and the countryside near Burton and Goessel yields few reminders of the tornado's path. Relatively new construction is the only thing that suggests something may have ever happened, but the happy families, lush trees, and well-maintained yards bring other things to mind. Images of rural bliss, a peaceful life in the American heartland. The residents of these communities make sure the memories of those who died live on, and that the tornadoes themselves are never forgotten. In 2015, to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the outbreak, the Hesston Mennonite Church gathered members of the community together to share memories of the twister, to reflect, to remember, and to educate the younger members of the community on what their town had been through. The Hesston Public Library keeps an archive of pictures, stories, and videos documenting the twisters, their aftermath, and the recovery efforts. This page will be linked in the description below if you want to research this event further. Tornadoes are still a regular occurrence in central Kansas. Just earlier this year, a group of intense to violent tornadoes traversed areas not far from where the Hesston and Goessel tornadoes tore their own paths of devastation, including one that struck the village of Plevna. Yet, thankfully, all of the communities impacted by the tornadoes on March 13, 1990, have been spared from another impact in the 30-plus years since. But when thunder roars, you can count on the residents of these two rural Kansas towns to know just what to do to keep everyone safe. Thanks to the memory of one ordinary March day in the spring of 1990. This has been Overcast. Thank you for watching.